everyone, my name's Tony Ridley, and once again thank you for joining us for another session in the travel, health, safety and security training sector. So today what we're going to be talking about in the broad spectrum of business travel, specifically whilst business travel is all encompassing with everything from airlines to hotels to events to factory tours to emerging markets, developed economies, all those sorts of things, we're going to talk about one specific element that's often overlooked yet is a common denominator in almost every element of travel, and that is the use of taxis and cabs. So the first question is, how safe is it to travel? And specifically we're going to be talking about in this session to travel by taxi in a specific country within the Asia Pacific region. As I said before, it's a common denominator across all elements of business travel, that commute from the airport to the accommodation, to the office, to the meeting, to the convention, whatever the case may be, and also the commute back to the airport. And invariably taxis feature quite prevalently in the decision making process. Unfortunately, when people travel from one location to another, they often overlook that the cabs are not of the same standard. You know, all of the encompassing elements that constitute ground transport travel, and taxis in particular, are not standardized. Each country has its nuances, each country has its strengths, its weaknesses, its variances. It's important to give this some kind of spectrum or analysis to determine whether in the first instance it's even safe or practical to utilize and implement taxis and cabs. Now, much like some of those social metrics that you've heard about, what's the price of a pint of beer, or what's the price of a quarter pounder, a McDonald's meal, it's a standardized process. So whilst the consumption or the product remains universal, this is where we then start to get our own benchmarking and references, so it's more understandable and comprehensible to both travel managers as well as travelers themselves before they undertake something that could potentially be life-threatening or a safety hazard in the very least. So first of all, how do we come about this? Well, let's look at what the final solution looks like. So first of all, let's determine that we have a graph, we have a number of variables, we've identified that we have a scale, and on that scale we're now going to apply a series of measurements based on particular countries and activities. But the universal mode of transport here is cabs or taxis. So first of all, let's take a country like Pakistan within the region, and then we make an assessment on the overall risk rating relative to Pakistan when using cabs. We then make a comparative analysis to a country like India, for example, and so on and so forth. We start to then make standardized assessments, that is the same assessment criteria for each and every location universally. And we can then drill further down as well, because some countries, because of their geographical diversity or spread, each city may be have its varying standards. More remote locations could be even more problematic, or they could even be better. It depends. It requires an analysis. So then we're able to now make comparisons between apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. So overall, we're now got an understanding of the spectrum where each and every country may lie. Now, remembering this is not the final analysis data. This is for demonstration example purposes only, and I've deliberately omitted a number of countries in the process as well. So, but this gives you an overall understanding of how this may look. So from a decision-making process, we can then determine what our threshold of our tolerance is. So we can have a median or an average or a percentile score that we simply draw a line through this, and we determine that this is the minimum standard of safety, security that we will apply, and nobody is to travel using this means of transport unless there's modifiers or there's some sort of treatment solution put in place. Now, this is the naked threat, the naked score. So this is before any alterations have been made with improvements to vehicles, drivers, or we've even looked at our own proprietary transport, our own specified drivers and so on. This is what the naked threat looks like. So as you would expect, if you introduce modifiers and treatment solutions, then you should get a change in that overall rating. So in the first instance of, say, let's Pakistan, if we were to use a different solution or introduce some modifiers, then we could quite reasonably expect that overall threat be reduced to a more palatable or acceptable level, and even more comparable to some of the countries or locations on the lower end of the scale. So it's not something that once you've come to a final solution, it's irrevocable, and it's not susceptible to change. Again, you can modify the process. So this is what the overall final solution would look like, something along these lines, where both either a traveller or a travel manager could simply quickly look at the underlying information or the final solution and make a very quick determination. So how did we get to that? Now let's walk backwards here. So some of the criteria that we've looked at, we've assessed driver ability, taxi reliabilities, accessibility, road conditions, speeding, and of course cost. These are some of the basic fundamental elements that are universal to the use of taxis and cabs. So we've included that in our calculation, but we've also gone far wider and we've looked at traffic, road accidents, vehicle conditions, crime, scams, distances, as well as English language. Now, if you've got a different lingua franca or trade language within your company, by all means substitute that, but I've used English here for the purposes of analysis because it tends to be and is increasingly the more likely universal language across the region. So considering all of these factors, all of these elements, we then have to come up with a measurable unit of measure, and in this instance I've used here a 5-star rating. So 5-star for universal translation is the equivalent of very good or in the top 20%, 4-star is good or in the top 40%, all the way down to 1-star, which is very bad and in the bottom 20%. So this gives us a sliding scale in which we can assess the criteria. Now each individual process can be applied with different rating systems. So you might find vehicle condition is of a higher concern, so therefore it has a 7-stage rating, and so on and so forth. So you can not necessarily manipulate the process, but you can give greater emphasis to certain areas to come up with your final results. It could be cost, it could be distance, it could be a whole host of other things, but that's the fundamental baseline that I've used here. This is the one that I tend to utilize and recommend for clients, or the one that I use in my own standard methodology to determine some of the variables associated to travel, health, safety and security issues within the region. So let's look at the relative rankings. So this is what the final calculation looks like. So first of all, we've got a graduated scale. So you can see on the left with the orange bars and numbers, the highest all the way down to the lowest, and then that's replicated on the right hand side with a percentile value. So obviously the higher up into the red we get, the further we get away from the median, which is the central score, and then the further down into the green is the further distance away. So everything in sort of the amber to the orange and light green color is sort of central. So if we put a line straight through the center there, which Vietnam in this instance, this could be our risk appetite, this could be our threshold for determining whether we do or we don't travel by taxis, or whether we're forced to implement modifiers, or we utilize our own means of transport through train drivers, company vehicles, all those sorts of things. So anything above that particular line is mandatory and requires a modifier, or we simply don't use, and we then have some other alternate selection, or we may even reconsider the overall use of whether the trip proceeds at all, because as I said, motor vehicle accidents and motor vehicle safety is far more concerning than aviation safety standards. Conversely, anything below that line we could be very comfortable with. We could say, well, that's our standard, that's our appetite. We may still apply some modifiers, we may have some improvements along the way. We continue to monitor the process and ensure that it maintains its relative rankings, but we could be quite happy with that overall process. So how did we come to it? What was the actual process that we engaged? Well, first and foremost, we went into a detailed analysis where we did cross sections of all of the assessment criteria as well as the relative countries. So the raw data, the naked data, then is found here. So on scales 1 through to 5, we've got the various data. So as you can see, you develop somewhat of a heat map where the more darker colours from the ambers up to the reds then determine where we're getting into our higher thresholds of risk, or we're getting into the more concerning elements of health, safety and security associated with taxis. We then have some of the other variable data down the bottom where we've assessed the median, which is the middle scoring that we've had on average, standard deviation, which determines and helps us identify those elements that have drifted away from the core center, that is where most of the information is clustered, much like a bell curve, the top 10%, bottom 10%, where are they and how are they relevant, as well as the average. So we get an understanding, we're able to cross-sect and dissect this information and use it in its relative sense, so the information is far more capable of being used as a decision-making tool rather than a random bunch of numbers that then punches out a pretty graph at the end. Further to that, then we have our final ratings, which you showed there before, which have the ups and downs and various relative rankings based on the particular countries. And certainly last but not least, we then have the percentiles, so we can then work out our quartiles in the top 25, the bottom 25, the middle 50%, all of those sorts of processes. So this is all of our raw data, which we can then generate a variety of slides and recommendations and graduated scales and graphs and all those sorts of things. But this is where the hard work is done. This is where the information is updated, maintained relevancy, and it's interrogatable. This is where the empirical process with numbers, not word pictures and verbal descriptions, this is where the hard facts and figures lie, so we can then produce that overlying guide and result for both travel managers and travellers to make an informed decision, particularly if they need to alter a plan, an itinerary midway through a business travel or impromptu travel. They're then able to make these informed decisions and determine if and how what they need to do as modifiers or treatment solutions to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. And in this instance, you'll see some areas where it's becoming painfully obvious in this demonstration that you would need to apply a number, if not significant amounts of modifiers, or just reconsider your overall use of taxis in the first instance, because it would simply be too hazardous or too potential for risk or guaranteed risk based on the analysis and findings of these surveys. So once again, thanks very much for joining us in this Travel Health Safety and Security Advisory session. Hopefully this has been helpful for both the managers of travel to determine and identify some of the prevailing risks associated with their business travellers, and of course also for business travellers to understand and apply the fundamentals of travel health, safety and security to ensure that they are far more effective, productive and certainly safer when they travel. For more information on this particular subject, or to get more of these travel training series, please visit my website at tony-ridley.com, or you can send me an email and contact me at tony@tony-ridley.com. Once again, thanks very much for joining us. Hopefully this has been helpful, and once again, safe travels to all. Thank you and goodbye.